We have a very short window right now to act.
The energy system that we had is basically preventing us from experiencing nature and clean air on a daily basis.
The way that we get this energy is literally killing us.
So welcome to the fourth episode of the Dino Talks, brought to you by the UN Development Programme and We Don't Have Time. Let me try and just set the scene a little bit about why we're doing these episodes for those viewers that maybe haven't caught the first, the second and the third episodes. Just before COP26, that was the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow last year, a new campaigner took to the stage of the General Assembly of the United Nations, warning the world not to choose extinction. This was Frankie the dinosaur. I nearly said Freddie, but I know that's wrong because that's the name of my son. It's Frankie the dinosaur. And he's the front man for a viral campaign by the UN Development Programme on the urgency to phase down and perhaps phase out fossil fuel subsidies.
You okay? You need a minute? Cool. Okay. Listen up, people. I know a thing or two about extinction. And let me tell you, and you'd kind of think this would be obvious, going extinct is a bad thing. And driving yourselves extinct? In 70 million years, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. At least we had an asteroid. What's your excuse? You're headed for a climate disaster, and yet every year governments spend hundreds of billions of public funds on fossil fuel subsidies. Imagine if we had spent hundreds of billions per year subsidizing giant meteors. That's what you're doing right now. Think of all the other things you could do with that money. Around the world, people are living in poverty. Don't you think helping them would make more sense than, I don't know, paying for the demise of your entire species? Let me be real for a second. You've got a huge opportunity right now. As you rebuild your economies and bounce back from this pandemic, this is humanity's big chance. So here's my wild idea. Don't choose extinction. Save your species before it's too late. It's time for you humans to stop making excuses and start making changes. Thank you.
We Don't Have Time. We were also at COP26 in Glasgow. We absolutely love this campaign. And we tried to support it by not least having a counter on our stage, which was counting up the amount of money that governments had spent on fossil fuels from the beginning of that UN climate conference. And the universal response from people that saw those numbers on the screen was, this is absolutely crazy. We've kept that counter going since COP26, and we'll keep it going all the way up to the next UN climate conference in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And there it will have grown to gargantuan sizes, I can assure you. The International Monetary Fund is behind the numbers that we use, and they look at the direct fossil fuel subsidies, so say payments to fossil fuel companies like petroleum companies, coal companies, but they also bring in the so-called externalities, how those fossil fuels that are subsidized are actually damaging our health and damaging our economies. So their numbers are quite large, and they calculate, if you combine both the direct subsidies and the externalities, you're looking at somewhere under just about $6 trillion. Our first episode aired on March 14th, and as I say, this is our fourth episode, and we will have a special one in Egypt at the next climate conference. Just before we go to the show in proper right now, episode 4, let me also say that there are different perspectives on the actual cost of these fossil fuel subsidies. We've had a very nice follower of We Don't Have Time, a former expert with the OECD, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, an expert called Ronald Steenblick, and I hope you're watching, Ronald. Ronald thinks we should really focus on the direct subsidies, which in the last calculation were somewhere over $580 billion a year, rather than the externalities. It's clearly a complex topic. There are lots of perspectives, but I think where we all agree is that whatever they are, the direct or the direct plus the externalities, this is a huge amount of money being spent on subsidizing fossil fuels, creating more climate change, and this money could be better spent on human well-being in all kinds of more interesting ways. So today we're going to take a deeper dive into fossil fuel subsidies and poverty. And this can be glimpsed through many, many different lenses. From the money being spent on fossil fuels, which could, if fossil fuels were phased out, be spent on overcoming poverty and inequality, or providing better healthcare, or providing a basic income to marginalized households and communities. Or you could look at the poverty story through the loss of life and livelihoods and homes triggered by the rise of extreme and more frequent climate-related weather events, like the floods that recently devastated parts of South Africa with an entire year's rainfall in 48 hours, all fueled in part by fossil fuel subsidies. We could also look at the air pollution. We could look at that impacting the poor disproportionately because of where they live. We could look at the rich benefiting from fossil fuel subsidies because they've got the cars, whereas the poor don't have them and therefore they don't use the fossil fuel subsidies. And we could also look at how the poor are often kept using domestic fossil fuels in their homes when, if the money was better spent, they could have clean, green, renewable energy, which could also be good for better livelihood opportunities. This episode is brought to you by We Don't Have Time in collaboration with our supporting partner, Prime Computer. I'd also like you now to download the We Don't Have Time app at wedon'thavetime.org, and then you can ask questions to the guests and also interact with the We Don't Have Time family, which is something like 65,000 organizations and entities and individuals and civil society members, UN, and businesses worldwide. And they're collectively generating about 65 million in social engagement per month. Let me introduce our first guest on this program. It's Karthik Ganesan, who's a fellow and director and research coordinator at the Council of Energy, Environment and Water in New Delhi, India. He's an engineer by training. He's got a bird's eye view of what his organization is doing, of ongoing and planned research, and he also ensures there's coherence in their research directions and their imperatives. Now, Karthik and his colleagues, working with other groups like the International Institute for Sustainable Development, have also been looking at fossil fuel subsidies in India, including via their recent report, Mapping India's Energy Subsidies 2020. Karthik, could you tell us a little bit about the findings from this report and also what the implications might be in respect to poverty and powering up a sustainable transformation and a transition in India, for example? So, Karthik, you have the floor.
Thanks, Nick, for that the kind introduction. I spent my formative years in the beautiful country of Oman till the age of about 15. There were 5 air conditioners in the house that I lived in, the four-bedroom apartment. Never a power cut, like flowing water in the taps that literally came from boiling the ocean, and petrol prices that didn't really change for the 6 years that I was there, right? And I came back to India, the city of Chennai, in 1998, and power cuts were advertised and scheduled in the local newspaper, and my mom had to literally figure out how to operate all the different appliances at home in right in time for the cooking to happen. Power holidays, as they were called, were commonplace in the Detroit of Asia at that point in time. Chennai is the car capital of the country. and drinking water was hand pumped, and had to be hauled 3 stories in the in the middle income group apartments that I lived in. And and we didn't have a vehicle. And Chennai's auto drivers, the tuk-tuk drivers are notorious, as everybody would know. And the bus became the go-to transport option. And in 2020, when you cut to, right, not much has really changed. Of course, it's become more prosperous, so there are more vehicles on the roads, despite the historic high prices that we're currently seeing. The city now has a desalination plant, right, to supply to augment the capacity of water that it's actually able to provide. And private vehicles are jostling for space with public transport, which seems to have kind of really lost traction. So as you can see, the two societies that I've described, despite this passage of time, tells me that there is still this big diversity and disparity in the way Indian cities in India consumes energy vis-a-vis even a country like Oman, which is, while energy rich, is perhaps not as rich as some of the developed countries. And that's really become the reason why my group studies, energy subsidies and the way we are promoting energy consumption. I mean, and why are we discussing energy? Obviously, is because at the end of the day, to exercise human freedoms in a concrete manner, and not just this limited notion of freedom, right? We require more energy. Going forward, humanity will be consuming more energy, not less. It's just that we need to figure out how do we get all of that energy from sources of supply that don't add to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And historically, of course, the world has relied on a whole bunch of inefficient sources of energy, carbon-based energy. And right now, it's the developing countries that are caught in the crossfires because we've made a paltry contribution, because we've not consumed as much fossil fuel as the rest of the world has. But the challenge is that if we continue to consume fossil fuels at the rate at which we do, if we continue to, then we enter this unknown territory of climate change, and it's very likely that we won't have resources to take things for granted as we have. For instance, the monsoon, which we are so dependent on. Most of the agriculture in India actually happens based on the monsoon, and it's unirrigated. What will happen to them? And more importantly, things like the delicious mangoes that India is known for really depends on the heat that the pre-monsoon season actually holds. If the monsoons go for a toss, if the heat is sort of too much or too less, then the summers has become intolerable, because the mango is really the only reason that I look forward to the summers in India, to be honest. So India, as I said, right, is in this this weird space of how do I handle this big expectation. And at the same time, what really happening is that our ability to negotiate these the extreme events is very limited as compared to, for instance, the Tokyos of the world, right? I mean, there's an example that comes to mind of this cavern that Tokyo built at a cost of $2 billion. 13 years of civil works that can empty 80% of the reservoir capacity that supplies to the city of Chennai, right, in a matter of minutes. And that's the level at which they are climate proofing. India cannot afford to do that because we just don't have the resources to be able to build such infrastructure. So if our basic building block that goes into our society is energy, how does India handle this? And I think the COVID-19 pandemic really brought to the fore what challenges ails the Indian system. And I'll refer directly to this issue of air quality. To me, air quality is the problem that India faces here and now, much less so climate change, because air quality impacts the outcomes for this current generation of youth who are the demographic dividend, as the rest of the world refers to them as. And specifically the plight of the poorer among them, who are actually exposed a lot more to poorer air quality, is came to the fore during COVID. And you may have seen news articles of how from the city of Jalandhar, which is in Punjab, right, people were basically seeing the ranges of the Himalayas, which are about 200 kilometers away, when all of the activity had come to a standstill. And this was a phenomenon that was noted across the Indo-Gangetic plains, with many cities, and citizens sort of showcasing these photos of the Himalayas, through crystal clear skies, early mornings. And it was fantastic to behold. But at the end of the day, the energy system that we had is basically preventing us from experiencing nature and clean air on a daily basis. And more than 2/3 of the particulate matter in the air that we put in is basically coming from fossil fuels and the derived products. And that is the imperative for India to address the consumption of fossil fuels, much more so than the emissions that contribute to CO2 and global warming. Because 20 years ahead later, we may be contributing in a significant way to the way in which climate change is happening. But right now, we're at the receiving end, right? And more importantly, if you look at it, cities, for instance, they are hamstrung by poor finances. They manage waste in a very in a very inefficient manner. And waste at the end of the day is also fossil fuel, right? And cities spend a phenomenal amount of money just taking them to landfills and dumping them. And we've seen what exactly is happening, right? You may have all seen of the landfill fires in the city of Chennai and in the city of Delhi, right, which spewed out toxic air on account of warming and the gases that were released, and the instant and sort of like the flash fires that caught on in those. So what little clean havens that existed in India 2 decades ago don't exist anymore, and we can't sustain this. And pollution, as I said, impacts cognitive abilities, and this is one reason why India needs to address this issue of how India consumes fossil fuels. And let me sort of take this back to it, right? While we as a country have low per capita energy consumption, there is disparity in the way we consume energy. For instance, the average household in Delhi, right, consumes as much electricity as a household in Germany. Let that sink in, right? I mean, yes, Germans also use gas for heating, but the point is, on a electricity per capita consumption, per household consumption, Germany and Delhi are alike. So, and India is not an agglomeration of multiple Delhis. India has this massive spectrum where Delhi is at one end of it. And 35% of India still cooks on what's called a chula, which is basically a traditional cook stove, right, which uses solid fuels, right? And as a result of that, there is emissions that come from the use of that fossil the wood and the dung cakes that are used in it, and which is basically within the household. And whereas the rest of India, which is the remaining 65, cooks using cooking gas. And let me also add this: you might think that this is just sort of the rich poor divide that's playing out, but the challenge is this is a very perverse regime that we kind of live in. For instance, I mean, the example that I often take is where Delhi, for instance, right, I don't pay any charges for up to 200 units of electricity that I might end up consuming in a month. If I limit my consumption to 200 units, no matter what my income, I get a subsidy. It's completely free. Whereas the same amount of consumption, if it had to happen in a poor household in one of the more economically backward states in the country, you would find that they have to pay about 1,000 rupees a month, which is about 15 or $16 a month, which is a phenomenal amount of money for that poor household. So there is this massive disparity in the way Delhi treats its citizens versus how citizens in other parts of the country are treated. I mean, I'm talking about electricity primarily because electricity, again, in India today is largely coal-fired. So you're subsidizing effectively a form of energy that comes from the use of coal. Why would you want to do that? Right? Why would you not incentivize more efficient consumption of energy, looking for alternatives instead of sort of blindly subsidizing their consumption? We talk about LPG, for instance, right? I mean, and India started providing LPG to its households in the 1960s. It's taken us a good 5 decades for it to become the dominant fuel in about 70% of the households. The remaining 30% don't even use LPG on a daily basis. They still use, as I said, the solid fuels in their houses. And what if I were to tell you that over the last 2 decades, nearly, right, about $3 billion a year has been provided as subsidy to people who are early adopters, to the rich in the cities, to the rich in the rural areas, and to a whole bunch of other consumers. Whereas more recently added poorer consumers under a scheme that the Prime Minister of India presciently inaugurated, called the Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana. About 80 million new connections were released, and they would constitute largely the poorer population. We spend less than $500 million a year over the last 5 years, and that's basically come to a stop. So think about it: $3 billion a year over the last 2 decades for the rich and for people who are early adopters, versus $500 million for the poor who really desperately need it. So this is the disparity that I'm seeing when we look at the way India has supported fossil fuel consumption. And ultimately, it's their consumption of solid fuels that's actually resulting in 30% of the ambient PM 2.5 pollution across the country. Should we not address this disparity by targeting the subsidies, or for that matter, instituting new subsidies to ensure that they actually end up transitioning to cleaner fuels, and ultimately realize that cleaner fuels means better outcomes for us as well? And if you look at, for instance, urban transport, right? We build more flyovers, expressways, despite 63% of urban population reporting that walking is the most frequently used mobility choice for them. How many cities focus on walking and cycling infrastructure as opposed to, or for that matter, even public transport, as opposed to laying more roads, right, or going the American way? right? Layers and layers of flyovers and expressways to facilitate faster movement of cars. In a city like Delhi, for instance, cyclists and pedestrians invariably belonging to the lower economic strata account for nearly 50% of road fatalities. And that's because very little has been thought about their needs of commuting. So addressing the energy needs of the poor can actually go a long way in ensuring that a society like us improves productivity overall, right, and increases demand-driven growth in the economy as well. So after the pandemic, the recommendation from leading economists across the country was to put money in the hands of the poor to stimulate consumption. So while this is a steep ask for a country like India, where obviously economic deficits have also become front and center primarily on account of rising import bills, right? Shifting money into the hands of the poor, especially by way of targeting subsidies, is a phenomenally impactful way of doing it. So we found, yeah, yes, Nick.
I think that's really comprehensive, Karthik, and very fascinating. And Cassie will come in shortly. That's our co-presenter from UNDP, and comment on both the remarks that both our wonderful guests have said. But there's some very interesting stories in what you've just told about the subsidies and where they go and who gets them, and is that the best way to spend money? Yeah, cool. Our next speaker. Our second guest is Ramon Cruz. He's president of the Sierra Club, which is headquartered in Oakland, California. Or I think Ramon is actually coming through from the wonderful New York City. Among his career highlights are Deputy Director of the State Environmental Regulatory Agency in New York. Was that right? No, Puerto Rico. And yeah, a long way off, but still very important. And senior positions at, for example, the Partnership for New York City and the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy. Ramon has joined mass demonstrations in Washington, D.C. to protest government policy that leaves some of the poorest people in the United States disproportionately impacted by the fossil fuel industry and its pollution. And the Sierra Club was one of 500 plus groups who recently called on Congress in the United States of America to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. Ramon, perhaps give us a little bit of your perspective on what fossil fuel subsidies mean in the United States of America, perhaps through the lens of the poor there.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Nick, and thanks for the invitation, to be part of this program and to join you today on behalf of the Sierra Club, which is the oldest and largest environmental advocacy organization in the United States. We started 130 years ago by John Muir as mostly a club of privileged people, to enjoy and preserve the outdoors in the Sierra Nevada in California. But today we have grown to nearly 4 million members and supporters and volunteers, that work not only to preserve and protect nature for future generations, but to center that on equity and justice. That part is important because, at moments in the past, the environmental movement not necessarily saw eye to eye with what is called the environmental justice movement, with a broader progressive movement for social justice, with the realization that environmental rights are also human rights, are women's rights, are reproductive rights, are racial rights, etc. So we cannot separate those, and so we have to build a movement that is inclusive, that we cannot go forward as a society unless we bring everyone together, and that is the movement that we need to continue building and expanding. We know that the climate crisis will affect the most vulnerable in society, and in the case of the United States, these vulnerable communities tend to also be darker, Black and brown communities that have been neglected by institutions due to systemic racism. And so we cannot win this battle, against the climate crisis unless we also tackle these social injustice harms. The current economic system with the extractive and fossil fuel industries based itself in the notion that we have to sacrifice certain places for the greater good of society, for economic growth. And when you deem some places as sacrifice places, then the people living in those places become disposable, and you cannot accept the notion of a disposable people unless, this is supported by a racist or supremacist ideology that is complacent with that notion, right? So, and often we see that all over the world with the legacy of colonization, so that's why we have to break with this, and when it comes to the fossil fuel industry, these have thrived in a culture of profit over people and of these sacrifice places. And so we have to make that transition to a clean economy. And of course, there's going to be a lot of problems with it. But, right now, as we saw with the, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and all the reports, but now it's giving an ultimatum, no? We have to make that transition, of that. We're at the moment of, it's very similar to when the United States 150 years ago or more was, arguing whether to finish with what was perceived as the engine of the economy. Back then it was slavery, and so it was only doing that step and making the moral, not only the moral, but also seeing that if you stay behind in that technology, if you would, if you could call it that pervasive system like that, of the past, then you wouldn't be able to, to move on to the technology of the future. And it was only when stopping slavery that, spurred that whole innovation era that became the Industrial Revolution, that of course now we're trying to cope with the problems that brought in. So that's the conundrum that where we are right now, and that we have to take steps to then finish with such systems. So yeah, right now, as you mentioned, I have joined many protests in the past, but last week, for example, on Earth Day, I joined several other environmental organizations, environmental justice organizations, labor unions, sustainable business leaders, elected officials, and, to demand action for climate change and climate justice. So, we have a very short window right now to act, at least in the US, where the stars are aligned, politically. And even then, as we have, a president and a Congress that that were elected on the platform of, of acting on climate, we see how, in such a system, a minority can still block everything. And one person has so much power to basically bring down that agenda. And with the US being one of the leaders in the world, then, bringing the whole world down with it. So, we're doing as much as we can to pass the package of legislation that, we have invested a lot of time and resources in building this agenda that President Biden is putting forward. Not only includes, the over, 550 billion, in clean energy, electrification, but also addressing justice issues. So there's something called Justice 40, that would focus 40% of the revenues, from this clean transition into EJ communities or environmental justice communities, to ensure that the communities that have, carried that the worst consequences of the climate crisis can also benefit from this new era, hopefully, of innovation and technology, etc. No, so that it's not only the rich getting the infrastructure to drive fancy electric vehicles, but that it goes to everywhere. So we see this as the opportunity of a generation, and the last one we have to the last opportunity to do something, right? We hear this statement that we're the first generation to really feel the consequences of climate change, and the last one, that can do something about it. So especially for the poor and the most vulnerable, we know that, the rich, may pay for air conditioning to go through a heat wave, but many cannot afford that. And that's the people that then you hear in these statistics that are dying, the elderly dying in such heat waves, and so we know that they will suffer the most. So we need to ensure that we care for as many as possible in this, changing climate and changing world.
And the fossil fuel subsidies are a wonderful chance to take some of that money being spent on fossil fuels that's causing climate change and provide eco-friendly air conditioning units to the old that need them. So yeah, this is where the money can be used in better ways to help counter poverty. So let me bring in my wonderful co-host, Cassie Flynn. Cassie Flynn is UNDP's strategic advisor on climate change and head of the Climate Promise, which I love. I hadn't heard that one before, but that's a good one. She's also an internationally recognized expert on global treaty negotiations on climate change. Cassie has provided advice, or doesn't provide advice to countries on how to develop and fulfill their pledges under the Paris Climate Agreement. She served as a senior advisor to the Prime Minister of Fiji, who was then president of the 2017 UN Climate Conference. And Cassie was named the 13th most influential person on climate change in 2017 by Analytica. So, hey, we've got a celebrity in our midst here. Cassie, can you just come in briefly and comment on what our two wonderful guests have said? Because we're talking about climate change, but we're also trying to talk about poverty. We also want to link the fossil fuel subsidies into these two dynamics, yeah?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick. And Karthik, Ramon, it was fantastic to hear from you about your different perspectives on this. And I think there were really sort of three things that I started thinking about as you both were talking. And the first is this real conundrum that we find ourselves in, where we know that we need energy to be able to fulfill our potential. We know we need energy for schools, we need energy for hospitals, we need energy for our computers. And the way that we get this energy is literally killing us. Karthik, you talked about even just the air pollution from fossil fuels and how that is affecting people's lives, not to mention all of the impacts of climate change and the extreme heat and the storms and everything that we're seeing. And how we deal with this requires transformational decisions that will completely change the world and change everything that we know. And fossil fuel subsidies are such a big topic because every country in the world has to deal with these, and every country in the world is affected by the choices that other countries make when it comes to fossil fuel subsidies. And so I think this is really important. And what I heard you both saying is sort of struggling with this conflict that we have right now. And the second thing that really struck me was also talking about this disparity among countries and disparity among communities within countries. And this is not only about the impacts of fossil fuels or the impacts of the climate crisis, but it's also about who has access to this energy, who has access to the clean stuff, who has access to the different types of solutions that we know exist. And I think, Ramon, what you were talking about in terms of all of these issues of social justice and environmental justice being human rights, environmental rights being human rights, is so critically important, because who has access to this and who doesn't have access to this is going to really dictate some winners and losers as the world moves forward. And this is quite a daunting task. The third thing that really struck me as both of you were talking was that we have more data, more information, more money than we have ever had before in the history of the planet. We know more about the climate crisis. We know more about how to solve it. But it is this moral question. It is this idea of what kind of world do we actually want to live in, and being able to make the smart choices. Karthik, you mentioned this idea of building more roads when most people walk around the city. And that type of decision is going to dictate an entire community and an entire country and affect actually the world. Ramon, you talked so much about, and I was so struck by this, the lifestyle overall means sacrificing some communities. And you talked about it in the context of the United States, but I think that can be applied to the world, right? I did a lot of work in the Pacific, and when you are in a Category 5 storm on an island in the Pacific, you are terrified, and you can feel your vulnerability in real time. And so thinking about how we address this as a collective community, I think is really more important than ever. And being able to imagine a future where we can solve these problems, we can cope with the climate crisis, and do it in a way that creates opportunities for everyone collectively. So yeah, I just really appreciate all of the comments.
Karthik, you just wanted to come in on that, yeah?
Yeah, Cassie used a word that I love. It's called coping, right? The thing is, with climate change, what I've seen in India is we are fantastic at coping. Life in India through the post-liberalization phase has really been about coping, right? When you don't have something, right, you make do with what you have. But the challenge is what climate change is doing is it's kind of throwing these curveballs in American parlance, right, that you can't cope with anymore. The levels of whether it's the rainfall that's coming through. Somebody talked about Nick talked about the rainfall that was dumped in in Africa. Same with the city, South Africa, right? In the city of Chennai, we get rains which are month long in a day. So you can't really cope anymore. And the thing is, everybody in an ecosystem like India is so used to sort of, just doing this walk around or the work around, right? There's this spirit of, for instance, the city of Mumbai, which gets flooded so often. They talk about this, this Mumbai spirit where the city rises every time. I mean, like, that really is actually an insult to the city, that they have to face this year in, year out, and the citizens have to be given this bravery awards for having sort of braved through it. That can't be the sort of like the thing that you keep going back to every year. So I feel that we need to move beyond coping, because that's really what the rest of the world has been doing. So I think in the Western context, I think there is a different connotation to coping, whereas in India we even have a word with it. It's called jugaad. It's called frugal economics, as it's called. So frugal economics has a term for it. You would have heard that India sent a like a spaceship to Mars, right, at a fraction of the cost that NASA did. So it's frugal economics. That's coping. But unfortunately, frugal economics and and workarounds are not a good thing for sustained good quality of life. It compromises quality of life at some point or the other. So I think in the developing country context, I would say we should do away with coping and have robust mechanisms that ensure that we're able to get this sort of like a decent quality of life and standard throughout the year, and not have to make do for much of the year, and especially in an era where things are not going to be very uncertain. So just a sort of nuance from a developing country perspective, Cassie. Yeah.
Cassie, have you got a couple of questions you want to maybe pose to our guests? Trying to now center back on the subsidy angle a little bit on this.
Absolutely. And this actually, as we've been thinking about and having this conversation, I was thinking a lot about the final days of COP26. And at COP26, we of course saw this big discussion about fossil fuel subsidies and fossil fuels being referenced in this big decision. And some say this was a huge success because for the first time they were in this decision. But many, and I remember even the Swiss environment minister taking the floor saying this is nowhere near where we need to be, and being quite critical of this wording. So I was wondering, Karthik, do you have any sort of thoughts on this and sort of thinking about that particular moment?
I didn't follow the final days, but on the fossil fuel subsidy phase out in the language, right? Absolutely. I mean, I can't deny that there is a requirement to phase out. But as I sort of mentioned in my opening remarks as well, I think in the context of countries like India, given that the alternatives are not yet cost competitive and we don't have the level of investment, despite the world being flush with money like never before, right? That money, it's not finding its way to, I think, a lot of the communities that need it, even in the West, the poorer communities, and let alone the citizens of developing world. Given the lack of those options, we will have to, I think, squeeze out what best we can from the limited resources to support the poorer communities for as much as needed. So phase out is perhaps, it's a bit early because, for instance, everybody is saying, why don't you turn to natural gas, in the interim? Because batteries are not yet mainstay, right, for managing the variability of renewable energy. And the West has used natural gas generously. But the price at which we get nat gas today, there is no way that the average Indian consumer could probably, consume gas at the delivered price of $10, $12 an MMBTU. right? People in the US get it at $3.50, $4. I mean, I'm talking about the large utilities, which then, of course, pad on their marketing costs. So without explicit state support, even moving away from an entity, from something like coal to gas, is a non-starter for us.
But
So,
Karthik,
and
can I just
yet,
come back on that? Because what I think you alluded to in your great opening remarks, and what you're alluding to now is, surely it's not beyond the wit of humanity to be able to say there are some very poor people here, right? They need energy. We can't get the clean stuff to them right now. How do we ensure that they get some subsidy on their fuel and support to switch to a cleaner fuel, but that the middle classes don't get the subsidy? So in other words, it's not a blanket subsidy, because I see, for example, in Indonesia, since the oil price spiked, they were spending $160 million a month last year on fossil fuel subsidies. Of course, now the oil price has spiked, they're actually paying over $700 million a year on fossil fuel subsidies, because presumably it's a blanket subsidy, so everybody gets it. There must be ways, mechanisms in a smart, high-tech, Silicon Valley country like India to get that stuff down to the really local people that need it.
Exclusion is the big challenge. If you end up excluding the really poor, right? And that's been the perennial fear, right? Especially the political backlash of excluding the people who probably deserve it, because you don't have yet systems in place for that kind of targeting. And targeting is ultimately a big challenge. Even if you look at the West, while today you're in that surfeit of data where you can identify everybody by different metrics. India also has this unique identification, number that everybody comes with, an Aadhaar number, but but identification of targeted beneficiaries for schemes and all of that is still a political quagmire. I don't think it's a purely technological play of just having the data and the instruments to be able to say you're poor, you deserve it. Right? There is also this political incentive to expand it to as many people. So you don't kind of lose out. And at the end of the day, what happens is you only have a pie that's this big, and the moment you expand it, the poor lose out, because the ability of the rich to basically tap into it is phenomenal, right? And more importantly, the data on metrics like wealth, which are a much better representative of your ability to kind of consume, are very poor in a country like India. We have reasonably okay data on incomes, but wealth, for instance, which is built over generations, we have no clue what it is on.
Okay, Ramon, let me just turn to Ramon just very briefly, because I just feel, Ramon, we've left you out a little bit here. But look, I don't have in my fingertips how much the US spends on fossil fuel subsidies, but let's assume a number. I don't know. Is it 50, 60, 100? I don't know. Maybe you know, but what couldn't this money be better spent on climate justice in those communities that you've identified? There's always a fight over money in the US, right? And I know Congress and the Senate is always hard to get change through, but if you could wave a magic wand and have everybody on board in Congress and Senate, this could be a great source of, being more efficient with fossil fuels if we have to have them for a limited period longer, and getting the money down to those people in those communities that need support.
It's a problem here, and it's a problem, globally. Most fossil fuel subsidies aren't really targeted, to help the poor meet their basic needs. Most of them end up going to producers of fossil fuels, in the form of tax credits or giveaways. So many companies basically do not pay the taxes that other industries have to pay. Then there's also the subsidies that are, direct funding received to foster production in a specific place, and many others like loan, and guarantees at favorable rates, or price controls, or governments providing resources like land and water at below market rates. So, or funding for research and development that other industries would have to take from their own budgets. So imagine, when you go and buy a house or rent an apartment, imagine you didn't have any interest rates or any broker's fees. Wouldn't your place look much better or different, if your furniture that, where you sleep, where you sit, everything could be discounted, or that the government provided all of the food, that you use, how you use certain things, they give it to you, if you buy specific ones. And that's what they do with the fossil fuel industry, so it's amazing how in the US, for example, you have all these conservatives criticizing handouts like welfare, and then calling poor people lazy because they are under welfare, when the real handouts and the ones bleeding the economy are really these oil executives, and the subsidies that their companies get, that, and these subsidies go straight to their bottom lines, so while you see many, you know, you see many CEOs, for example, paid so much. The Guardian was reporting, a week ago or so, how the CEOs received just between 2020 and 2021, about each of them at least 5 million extra of whatever they were doing. So when you add the 30 major companies, CEOs received, $500 million just going to individuals, to 30 individuals in the world. At the same time, in the US, they took about 8 billion in pandemic relief just the year before. So it's infuriating when you see that, a big percentage of that just went to individuals, so many of the subsidies, that would reduce costs for consumers aren't limited to the poor. And because the poor don't use it so much, the vast majority of these subsidies tend to benefit then the upper and middle classes. And we see that with, like, hybrid vehicles, electric vehicles, solar panels, etc., that end up in the people that actually can afford it. And there are definitely ways to drastically reduce these subsidies while ensuring that energy services are affordable to the poor. And you could narrowly, target them to low income households. Also, you could gradually shift those subsidies to cleaner alternatives. So if the government is subsidizing diesel to run, generators, those subsidies could be shifted to solar and battery systems to make them the preferred option. And incidentally, these subsidies are, most of them are wasteful and a drag on public budget. So, reducing them would definitely free up some resources for governments to spend on more valuable social services, and therefore should be attractive public policy regardless of their climate benefits. But now that we're in a climate crisis, then these are imperative. These are very much needed.
So, Karthik, one question that I keep thinking about is, what is the role of the federal government in India in weaning people off of fossil fuel subsidies?
One of the best mechanisms that the government of India has used in I think throughout probably even for the last 3-4 decades is keeping prices of fossil fuels high, which means that the consumption levels are naturally sort of at a lower level. I mean, it came up historically primarily because we did not have the resources to import all of what we needed. But now it's really become an addiction for the federal government in that it relies anywhere between 17 and 20% of its overall revenue base actually comes from taxation of fossil fuels. So in reality, what is happening in India is that the state takes money from one hand and gives with the other. Now, how much it gives actually is a lot less than what it actually takes. So in reality, India, on a purchasing power parity term, for instance, right, India is paying a much higher amount for the fuels that it actually consumes. And this is true for all of the oil and gas that we do. Not so much for coal, because coal is a resource that we're endowed with domestically, but a phenomenal amount of oil and gas basically comes through this way. So the real challenge for the government of India is it needs to wean itself away from its addiction to revenues linked to fossil fuel subsidies. And in India, we have this concept of what's called the Maharatna, which means the great jewel. And many of these public sector companies are all labeled Maharatnas because they're all jewels in the crown of India, in that they are some of the richest cash-rich companies in the economy. And you will notice, if you go look up the list of Maharatnas, that most of them are actually companies in the business of trading and producing energy. Right? Because ultimately that is the sort of like the juice that everybody gets, of which you can continuously keep tapping. unless we're really able to change this business model, right, it's going to be difficult for government of India to think of what is it going to rely on 20 years from now, right, when vehicles are running off electricity, or where there's not as much petrol and diesel in the ecosystem. What will they start really taxing? That's a question that I think they need to answer for themselves to see what will I be doing in 20 years from now.
Exactly. And we need, and we need to basically, tax award that efficiency, so create a system that awards efficiency rather than a system that awards the use of fossil fuel. And so that's where the incentives and the subsidies should go to develop a system that values efficiency. And so with that, we create more electricity by using less resources.
Cassie, come in. We're running out of time because these gentlemen have been very eloquent.
They've been fantastic, and if I can just build on actually what Ramon was saying, if we start to flip this on its head and we start to think about, okay, these are taxpayer dollars that are going to subsidize a handful of companies, you can imagine what we could subsidize instead. And you can imagine and we know, for example, at UNDP, we've done some work, and we could, if we took all of these dollars spent on fossil fuel subsidies, we could eradicate poverty 3 times over. We could vaccinate every person in the world 5 times over. We could have a temporary basic income that really helped lower and middle income families to be able to survive and thrive despite all of the turmoil in the world right now for about 6 months. There's an incredible level of things that we could start to invest in that help to level this playing field that Ramon and Karthik, you have been talking so eloquently about. And I think there's immense possibility there, but we just have to have the will to actually do it.
And COP27 is the time to do it, if not the next G20 meeting in Indonesia, yeah? Yes. Guys, I'm going to have to jump in here because this is normally a 45-minute show, but it's been so jolly good that we've actually gone to 53 minutes. So, but I want to thank the 2 guests here, Karthik and Ramon, Karthik coming in from India and Ramon coming in from the USA, to my wonderful co-host, Cassie, who really, really owned it in terms of understanding all the brilliant things you guys were saying and articulating the UNDP work on poverty as well. Thank you very much indeed. I hope the viewers have enjoyed it, and you can look forward to episode 5, which will come up soon, and we don't have time. We'll let you know when that is being broadcast as well. Thank you very much indeed. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye. Have a good day. Thank you.
We believe by rewarding climate solutions and warning all the polluters, we will make it profitable to save our planet and super expensive to destroy it.
We must now zoom in on the quality and the implementation of plans, on measuring and analyzing, on reporting, transparency and accountability.
We want to be better, and that's why we are open for climate dialogue.
We want to know what you think, and so that we can improve.
Let's give climate love to those that have the solutions. And let's send climate warning to those that needs to change.
I invested in We Don't Have Time because I actually agree, we don't have time.
We're trying to reduce CO2 collectively.
If we don't act urgently and quickly, catching up later won't work.
The drive to net zero is the growth story of the 21st century.
We had about $350 billion of direct subsidies and tax expenditures, tax breaks given to fossil fuels.
Have such an enormous mobilization of business, finance, civil society, and science all gathered here.
We have halved our own emissions between 2012 and 2017 and are now at a 70% reduction.
SSAB has decided to be the first steel company in the world to offer fossil-free steel to the market in just a few years.
There's lack of clarity, and it just feeds greenwashing and delays meaningful action.
We just have to go quickly. We have the technology. We don't have to develop technology.
We're going to create this huge wealth transfer from energy producers, who represent a tiny minority of people, to energy consumers, who represent all people.
We are in a climate emergency, and we are very far from where we need to be.
Get ahead of the curve or you're going to lose.
I was able to attend one demonstration that kicked off at Kelvin Grove all the way to George Square, and we had a lot of activists.
What I feel that I can bring is a young audience that maybe doesn't know what to think about climate change.
What is happening here, negotiating, it's so wrong from our perspective. You don't put a price on your mother.
Now, personally, I don't believe the fossil fuel industry should continue to be allowed to operate the way it's been operating for the last several decades.
We want to bring a voice to all the new solutions, the new ideas, the new entrepreneurs who are out there trying to kind of make a break and create this new climate economy.
They're setting a great example, and there's lots of other big businesses that should follow their example.
I really want to urge everybody just to be thinking more about land use and not just electrifying vehicles to, maintain the environment that got us here today.
They want to ban the word burgers, sausages, and steaks from being used on vegan and vegetarian products.
Tell them what they do so that they will be encouraged to do more. And together with the community or users, we share this to millions of people on social media, so this is getting noticed.
Let's bring in Shweta Chakrabarty tonight, risk and behavioral scientist and president of U.S. operations for We Don't Have Time.
As the name says, we don't have time.
ستوكهولم مؤسس منظمة ليس لدينا الوقت. We don't have time. السيد إنغمار رونسبورغ.
Joining us for more as We Don't Have Time's Nick Nuttall. Nick, welcome to the program.
And Nick, about this counter, speaking of numbers.
This is a clock that shows you how much money has been spent on fossil fuel subsidies since the beginning of the COP.
We have a climate crisis and we're still subsidizing the industry which is causing the crisis. I mean, it's completely dumb. I'm a finance guy, it makes no sense whatsoever.
$2.5 trillion went into subsidies for fossil fuel. That's a definition of insanity.
Still, this is a positive. It's the first COP decision that actually mentions coal power or fossil fuel subsidies.
We need to communicate climate action. Because if only a few people or a few companies are doing climate action without communicating it to others, we will not solve the climate crisis.